we know stereotyping has always existed. The difference I'm seeing is how much these stereotypes are really creeping into briefs. When you look at fast growth, it is absolutely over-indexing to youth. That burns out very, very quick. All the oxygen that the industry is talking about is around tech, data. I really think we all forget the only beings that buy stuff is human beings. It's human nature to want to look at what differences sit between segments. More powerfully, look at what unites them.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Marketers Debrief podcast from Journey Further. We are back, first episode of 2025, and we're talking all things audiences. Marketing anything is fairly redundant if you are not reaching the right people with the right message at the right time. We all know that, but it is still quite a common mindset within marketing and quite a temptation to go chasing after quick, aggressive results. Things like, we need to be tackling more Gen Z, or millennials will love this campaign because millennials love X. It's generational stereotyping, which is short-term thinking, which rarely leads to long-term success and can sometimes just be a waste of your marketing budget. And today's guest is on a mission to try and tackle that industry challenge. Journey Further's very own Lydia Hinchliff. Lydia, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Billy. I'm very happy to be sat here with you.
Good. I couldn't ask for anyone better for our first episode of the year. So, talk me through why this is such a challenge within the industry, which I think, am I right in saying you face quite regularly?
I do. So we know stereotyping has always existed, right? Just in the industry, but also broader society. The difference I'm seeing, particularly over the last few years, is how much these stereotypes are really creeping into briefs. So we're getting more and more briefs where the request is very focused on broad generalizations of who the audience is. And I think the reason why it's happening, yes, there's lots of noise around it, but there's more macro factors, I think. I think firstly, we're seeing short-termism, to your point, and people need things to be quick and they need things to be easy. And quite often, being able to just approach segmentation in a generational way hits that mark for people. And don't forget, I've talked about this before, but the tenure of marketing professionals in brands now is so short. They have such little time to make an impact. So any kind of hack, any quick way to achieve success is what they're going for. And I think also we also have to be aware of echo chambers that are happening. So if you watch or engage with any kind of content with a sensational headline like Gen Z demand X from brands, the algorithm then shows you more and more of that content. So you begin to think that everyone's talking about it, and then that kind of filters through. And I think people also make this a creative problem. And it's not just about messaging. I think it has implications across the whole of the 4 Ps. So take Adidas as a classic example. 2023 was a really bad year for them.
Right.
They lost money for the first time ever. Yes, part of that was down to the Kanye Easy debacle. But actually, if you dig a little bit deeper into their sales volumes, they still dropped 4%. Which is huge for a business that size. 4% is no small change. And when you dig into their kind of approach to marketing there, they were really focused on trend jacking, really going after those fast, quick wins that don't have that kind of sustainable last on that. You look at New Balance on the other side of the coin that's had sustainable growth year on year for the last few years. They've done something, I think, that's smarter. They've looked at universal values across generations. Let's say that's comfort. And they found ways to make comfort mean something to more people with small tweaks of messaging, but broadening that appeal. And also when they're reaching that audiences, they're looking at it at a broad appeal as opposed to trying to specifically just go after a youth audience. Adidas have actually, I must say, returned to growth this year, and actually they've done it a lot from product, because they've really focused on that kind of retro nostalgia trend that is a long-standing trend, and it is relevant whether you are 20 and it is relevant whether you are 40, and that has seen them shift back to focusing on a broader appeal, and I think that's led to their success.
But going back to, you mentioned a really interesting point about echo chambers and about how sensationalist titles like Gen Z love X, and then you'll see more and more. That is something which I see on LinkedIn all the time. I feel like that generation in particular are talked about far more than any other. And why do you think that is? Because yes, they might be the most kind of quote unquote exciting generation to try and tap into, but I guess they also have probably the least buying power.
They do. They absolutely do. I've done some research into this in terms of just taking a step back. Why do potentially we feel that Gen Z is valuable? And I looked at businesses' success and fail rate. And interestingly, when you look at fast growth, it is absolutely over-indexing to youth. That burns out very, very quick. And actually, if you look at insolvency rate amongst brands, it is the brands that index against that younger audience. So that kind of short-termism again, when you look at what robust brands are doing that have withstood recession, after consumer confidence crisis, after cost of living crisis, it is people that are appealing to a broader demographic. And, you know, we're an industry that loves the new. So we're always going to focus on that coming of age generation. But I think we're really missing a trick, because when a new generation comes up the ranks, it means when we look at what we mean by someone in their 50s, that's also evolving. That's also changing. And there is a lot less focus on that. And what's really exciting, I think personally, is there's this rise of the ageless generation, you know, where you couldn't put a number on them. If they were lined up, you couldn't tell how old they were, and their attitudes and behaviours, they're not defined by age. And I think we should be doing a lot more focus on that. Just bringing it back to brands that I've seen in the market doing this really well is American Express. So they've done, again, really sustained growth. And what they do is they look at those universal values and problems or needs that people across generations have when it comes to finance. And one of American Express's is that they want to feel part of an exclusive club. You know, there's exclusivity. But what exclusivity means by age does differ. So they ladder everything up to that exclusivity, but frame it differently dependent on who they are talking to. So for the more younger audience, it's much more leaning into that travel experience that is associated with American Express. And for the older consumers, that more premium service element, but they're still staying true to that kind of value that they bring across demographics.
We've briefly mentioned it a few times already. One thing which we've recently done, which I'm really proud of, I think it's one of the best things that Journey Further from a marketing and strategy perspective have done for ages, is we ran a little, well, quite a big social experiment, created a short film which essentially tried to debunk some stereotypes that are we hear far too often, and just to try and better understand how people from Gen Z, Millennial, Baby Boomer and Gen X really think and act. It was fascinating. You can watch it now on YouTube or on the Journey Further LinkedIn channels. Why did you want to tackle this problem in that way?
What frustrates me about this is that all the oxygen that the industry is talking about is around tech data at the minute. And sometimes I really think we all forget the only beings that buy stuff is human beings. So sometimes I think when we put these kind of statistics or try to shape an argument with graphs and charts, we forget that these are actual human beings. So it's really important for me that we visually got across that these are humans that we are trying to target. So yes, of course, algorithms have a role, data has a role, but we are still trying to persuade actually very irrational creatures, which are humans. So putting people into neat little boxes clearly is going to have flaws. And also what we were really careful to try and get across in the video is just how wide that spectrum is across those generations, because it's a massive gap. What a 50-year-old looks like and attitudes is very different from someone at the upper echelons of that generation at 65. And we just forget that because we're just bucketing them up in such big groups like that.
Yeah, it was brilliant. So to summarise for anyone that's not watched it yet, essentially we got a room full of, as I say, multiple generations, and then we asked them statements, essentially, such as, I listen to podcasts, or I prefer shopping online rather than on the high street. And then we asked them to step forwards if they agreed with that. And some of the outcomes were fascinating. Some very much kind of went along with what you'd expect, but then some were really surprising. Were there any that really stood out for you?
I think the biggest surprise was how few questions we actually got a divide. Because that was, I think at one point it was like, do we need to put some questions in where we can see a divide here? Because otherwise this is going to not be very compelling. But we didn't. We stayed true to it. But there was other surprising things of differences that we saw. So one of the things was talking about confidence. And there was a huge divide. It wasn't a generational one. It was a male-female one.
Right.
And when you see all those women step forward, when they're talking about how they feel about their future or how they feel if they're achieving the best that they can, and it's women that step forward, there's questions to be asked there. But and that was from the oldest in the room right through to the youngest. And I think so there was a lot more nuance showed there. There was one question where I really did think we'd have an older skew, and that was around trust of TV advertising. Because anything you read, if you are over 45, the only things you trust are TV and direct mail. And actually no one stepped forward. And like you alluded to earlier in terms of the buying power, there were shifts I expected, but when you're seeing it in real life and actually the reactions of the older generations, do you spend above your means? Every single Gen Z stepped forward. But you also saw the reactions of the older groups where, there was a real human moment there where they felt for them. And they genuine was sympathy with their situation. And I think sometimes we forget. We think that the older people they've forgotten what it's like to try and get on the housing ladder and all of those things. And they didn't. They genuinely had quite big reactions to those questions.
When viewers watch this film, what do you want them to take away from it? And what sort of excites you about, hopefully, the learnings that marketers and everyone can take?
I want them to be really excited and full of hope because that experiment showed us that there is so much opportunity out there for brands of all sizes and shapes to reach and attract audiences they've ruled out based on preconceptions. So where people are struggling to fight amongst the bottom, they could really carve out lots of opportunity for themselves by thinking, how do we make ourselves relevant for more generations? So I think that should be something to be really excited and go in and try new stuff to try to do that.
Now, one other thing that we're currently working on in the background is a research paper, which essentially is a bit more detail on everything we spoke about today and what was covered in the film. I've had a little sneak peek and it's already incredible. Some really, really interesting insight in there. You cover off quite a few actionable tips for brands and marketers to avoid falling into the trap of lazy generational segmentation. Could you give some of those away today?
Ooh.
Just a few.
I'm not sure I'm allowed. Yeah, so first and foremost, make sure your methodology and data is robust. If you are compiling segments based on a 3-slide deck on LinkedIn, challenge. If something seems too sensationalized, really research it and look into it before you kind of go in all guns blazing. The other piece of advice I'd always give people in any kind of segmentation is it's human nature to want to look at what differences sit between segments, but more powerfully, look at what unites them. because actually that hook to drive relevance for more people is more powerful than what separates them, what unites them. So something I'd always recommend you try and look for. And finally, when you're thinking about those marketing choices, whether that be channel, whether that be what platforms to use, prioritize what can be scaled, because we've talked a lot, and the research paper goes into this, that fast short-term growth on wobbly foundations isn't sustainable. So you will end up having a very strong period that you really then struggle to replicate. So you need to be able to scale your efforts, and it needs to be, will this still work when we're 10 times the size? Will there be enough opportunity for us to grow and continue to grow?
That's super fascinating. And today we've mentioned the word values quite a lot. And so values are clearly a great way and should be a better way to segment your audience. Are there any others?
Yes, absolutely. So there's many ways to group people. Values is always one that's easy to get across because you're meeting pain points. So that is very effective, and you can see how that impacts every decision. But other effective segmentations include behavioral segmentations. You can look at life stage. So there's a lot of research from behavioral scientists around when you're changing life stage. So you're becoming a parent, or you are entering a new decade. Actually, it's your prime for new brands, and not just new brands that are related to that event that you're going through, but it just seems to open your eyes to brands that you haven't previously considered. So segmenting people that way can be really effective. One of the most powerful things we've done for our clients, and if you watch the webinar, you'll hear about that, is where you're combining segmentation. So you're looking at values, what do they care about, but also you're bringing in behaviors. So as an example, you might want to look at people that really care that their money is safe. As a broad example, that safety net, they've got a very emotional connection to money, and actually that kind of safety and trust is really important to them. But you also want to segment that there's behavior there, that they are open to moving, because we know that changing banks, for instance, most people don't do it.
Never done it?
No, I haven't. So you want to be kind of combining those kind of behavioral signals that they may be open to it, but you know that actually your messaging and your choices around media really need to focus on the trust element. So you're bringing those two things together.
Love it. Now, you mentioned the webinar just then. So that's a short film that you can watch, a white paper you can read, and a webinar that you can listen to. There's a lot going on at the moment.
You have kept our strategy team very busy.
Which is what we like to hear. Give us a little plug as to when that will be and what that will be all about.
So we have the webinar on the 20th of February. Just after that, there'll be an opportunity to sign up for the research paper, where we've looked at many data sources to really give people a really rounded view of behaviours we are seeing across generations, but also bigger kind of behaviour shifts we're seeing across the piece, which is exciting.
Brilliant. Yeah, can't wait for it all. So Lydia, today's been fascinating. Thank you so much for joining me. If you could leave by summarising what you want people to go away from either this podcast, the webinar, the research paper, thinking and acting on, what would it be?
I would love you to look at your base and find out what age groups are you indexing against. And if you have really big biases towards certain generations, certain age categories, really ask yourself, is that because only those people are interested in my brand or service, or because my brand or service is only relevant to this audience? Or is it because my subconscious and the way I'm briefing and the way my agency is working, we have led ourselves down that path? And actually, is there untapped opportunities if we broaden out who we're targeting, how we're speaking to them? I think that'd be a really interesting thing for people to look at, just to make sure that they haven't fallen down a trap of that fast growth built on wobbly foundations.
Amazing. Well, there you go, guys. That is what you need to go and do. Lydia, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you, Billy.